Somewhere in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, inside a cave that smells like cold stone and river silt, scientists pulled a tiny sliver of bone out of the dirt. It was smaller than your thumbnail, and when they cracked open the DNA locked inside it, they didn't just find an ancient woman, they found a pattern that repeats itself over and over again across every Neanderthal site ever studied. A pattern that tells us something about what it meant to be a woman 70,000 years ago. That is, frankly, hard to sit with once you understand it. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about Neanderthals. We used to think of them as this side story to human evolution, the dumb cousins who lost the race. But ancient DNA doesn't care about the story we want to tell. It only tells you what actually happened. And what it's revealed about Neanderthal women, their lives, their choices, or more accurately, the choices that were made for them, is one of the most quietly devastating discoveries in modern archaeology. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why geneticists, when they first ran the numbers on these women, went quiet in the lab. You're going to understand why one particular skeleton, found half a world away from where she was born, rewrote what we thought we knew about Neanderthal society. And you're going to understand why some scientists now believe the very thing that made Neanderthal communities survive for hundreds of thousands of years might also be the thing that made it so easy for them to vanish. Before we go further, if stories like this, real science, real bones, real mysteries pulled out of the ground, are the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe now, so you don't miss what's coming next on this channel. Okay, let's go back to the cave. The site is called Chagyrskaya. It sits on the bank of the Chagyrskaya River in the foothills of the Altai Mountains. It's only about 100 kilometers from an even more famous site called Chagyrskaya Cave, the place where scientists first discovered an entirely new kind of ancient human from a single fossilized pinky finger. Chagyrskaya doesn't get that kind of fame, but what researchers found there, led by geneticists at the Max Planck Institute working with Svante Pääbo, turned out to be something special. Svante Pääbo is the man who eventually won a Nobel Prize for sequencing the first Neanderthal genome. What his team found had never been managed before in archaeology. Not a single skeleton, not a single genome, a family. They recovered genetic material from 13 different Neanderthals who lived in and around that cave between roughly 49,000 and 59,000 years ago. 7 men, 6 women, teeth, bone fragments, a jawbone. And once the team started comparing the DNA between individuals, a family tree started to emerge from the dirt itself. A father and his teenage daughter, a young male who was likely a nephew or a cousin, an older woman who appeared to be an aunt or maybe a grandmother. For the first time in the history of paleogenetics, scientists weren't just looking at isolated fossils anymore. They were looking at people who had actually known each other, people who had sat around the same fire. And that's where it gets strange. Because when they looked closer at the genetic diversity of the group, something didn't add up. The mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down only through mothers, was wildly diverse among the women. But the Y chromosome DNA passed down only through fathers was almost identical among the men. Every single male in that cave could trace his lineage back through a nearly unbroken male line. The women couldn't. Their genetic roots scattered outward in every direction, pointing to origins outside the group entirely. Researchers ran the numbers and found that more than 60% of the female Neanderthals in that small community had migrated in from somewhere else, somewhere far enough away that their DNA carried no trace of the local male lineage at all. Meanwhile, the men had stayed exactly where they were born, generation after generation, rooted to the same patch of riverbank their fathers and grandfathers had occupied. In other words, the women left. The men never did. Anthropologists have a name for this. It's called patriarchality, sometimes described as female exogamy, and it still exists in some human hunter-gatherer societies today. Sons stay home. Daughters are the ones who move. When a Neanderthal girl reached the age where she'd start a family, the evidence suggests something troubling. She didn't get to build that life among the people who raised her. She was, in effect, sent out, away from her father, her brothers, her home territory, and into a group of near total strangers, possibly a group her own people had violent or tense relationships with, in a world with no written language, no roads, no way to ever really go back and visit. Think about what that actually meant on the ground in the middle of an ice age, with predators like cave lions and hyenas roaming the same valleys these people hunted in. A teenage girl walking away from the only 60 or so people she had ever known in her life toward a cave full of unfamiliar faces. Because that is simply how her world worked. There was no negotiation implied by the data, no indication she had a say. It was structural, it was expected. It had probably been happening to every woman in her lineage for tens of thousands of years before she was even born. It's not just Chagyrskaya either, and this is the part that turns a single strange data point into an actual pattern. Years before the Chagyrskaya family was pieced together, researchers had already sequenced the genome of a different Neanderthal woman from that same wider Altai region. She is an individual known as Denisova 5, sometimes called the Altai Neanderthal, who lived somewhere around 90,000 years ago. When they read her genome closely, they found something that made the whole research team stop and double-check their data. Long, unbroken stretches of her DNA were completely identical on both the copy she inherited from her mother and the copy she inherited from her father. That specific pattern, geneticists will tell you, is the signature of extremely close inbreeding. Not just cousins marrying cousins, the way it sometimes happened in small, ancient human communities. The math on her genome pointed to something closer to a parent, an offspring, or two siblings, who shared both parents, having a child together. At first, some scientists wondered if this one case was just a strange outlier, a single unlucky roll of the genetic dice in one small, isolated valley. But then more Neanderthal genomes came in from other sites, and the pattern kept showing up. Smaller versions of it, less extreme, but present again and again. It started to look less like a one-time tragedy and more like a structural reality of Neanderthal life. When your entire breeding population is only a few hundred people scattered across an unforgiving landscape, and women are only moving between a handful of neighboring related groups, the pool of potential partners narrows fast. Sooner or later, the family trees start looping back on themselves. It becomes almost impossible not to. And there's a reason this pattern isn't just sad. It's actually one of the most important discoveries for understanding why Neanderthals eventually disappeared. Because when the researchers modeled out the overall genetic diversity of the Chagyrskaya group, the numbers were staggering. Lower than any recorded human population, ancient or modern. Lower than almost anything we've ever measured in a wild population that wasn't already circling extinction. The closest comparison scientists could find wasn't another prehistoric human group at all. It was mountain gorillas, a critically endangered species with only around 1,000 individuals left on the entire planet. The researchers estimated the Neanderthal community around that region likely functioned with something like a few hundred breeding males total, spread out over a vast landscapes, all connected by these same fragile threads of migrating women, which means the system of women leaving their birth families to marry into distant, unfamiliar groups wasn't some cultural footnote. It may have been the only thing standing between Neanderthal populations and full-on genetic collapse. Every woman who made that long, lonely walk to a new cave was, without knowing it, quite possibly keeping her entire species from folding in on itself. The very tradition that took so much from these women individually might be the reason Neanderthals lasted as long as they did. But here's where the story gets even more layered, because women weren't just the ones holding Neanderthal genetic diversity together. They were also, according to the DNA, the bridge between Neanderthals and us. In 2018, researchers sequencing a bone fragment from Chagyrskaya Cave made a discovery that stunned the entire field. The bone belonged to a girl, roughly 13 years old when she died. And when they read her genome, they found something that had never been documented before in any hominin fossil. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan, that other mysterious human lineage. She wasn't just descended from two different groups. She was, quite literally, a first-generation hybrid. Scientists nicknamed her Denny, a single bone, a single girl. Proof sitting right there in a chromosome that two entirely different kinds of humans had met and interbred inside that very cave, probably more than once. And this is where the genetics of Neanderthal women gets genuinely unsettling. Because when researchers zoomed out and studied interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans across thousands of years, they noticed something odd about the direction of the gene flow. There are documented cases of Neanderthal mothers having children with Denisovan fathers like Denny. There's Also, strong genetic evidence for modern human men having children with Neanderthal women, and that combination shows up again and again in the ancient genetic record. But researchers studying modern human genomes today have found something almost eerie. There is no Neanderthal Y chromosome left anywhere in living humans, not one. It vanished completely. Every trace of Neanderthal DNA that survives in people alive right now, and there's a surprising amount, came down almost entirely through mitochondrial lines and autosomal fragments. Not through Neanderthal fathers passing genes to sons. Some researchers believe this points to something called Haldane's rule, a pattern seen across the animal kingdom where hybrid offspring of one sex are less likely to survive or reproduce. If male hybrids between Neanderthals and modern humans were less biologically viable, generation after generation, the genetic pathway that survived into the future would have overwhelmingly run through the women. Neanderthal women having children with human men, their daughters having children with human men, quietly, invisibly, quietly folding an entire vanishing lineage into ours, one woman at a time, until the boundary between species blurred so much that a real, distinct Neanderthal genome effectively stopped existing altogether. There's one more layer to this that most people never hear about, and it involves Denisova Cave itself, not just Chagyrskaya. That single cave was occupied on and off for something like 300,000 years, first by Denisovans, then by Neanderthals moving in and out over tens of thousands of years, and eventually by modern humans as well. 3 different kinds of humans sharing the exact same shelter across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, though almost certainly never all at once. Layer after layer of sediment in that cave floor represents thousands of years of somebody's home. And buried inside those layers were the bone fragments that eventually gave us Denny, the Neanderthal-Denisovan hybrid girl, along with evidence of at least one other mixed ancestry individual whose father himself had a Neanderthal ancestor several generations back. Which means the meeting between these 2 lineages wasn't a single accidental encounter. It happened more than once, probably many times, likely stretched out across thousands of years, with women very often at the center of it. If you're the kind of person who wants to actually understand the world instead of just scrolling past it, this channel is where you'll find more of these deep dives. So go ahead and hit subscribe right now before we get into the last part of this, because it's the part that ties everything together. So let's put the whole picture side by side. A society where teenage girls were routinely sent away from their families into unfamiliar, possibly hostile groups, with no real choice in the matter purely because the survival of the wider gene pool depended on it. A population so small and so genetically fragile that researchers compare it directly to critically endangered species all on the edge of collapse. And a species whose only lasting legacy in the DNA of billions of living humans today survived almost entirely through the reproductive lines of its women, while the male lineage was erased so completely that not a single Neanderthal Y chromosome remains anywhere on Earth. When you line those 3 facts up, a picture starts to form that is honestly hard to unsee. Neanderthal women were, in a very real biological sense, the connective tissue of their entire species. They held together the genetic diversity of scattered communities by leaving everything they knew over and over generation after generation. And later, as Neanderthal populations began collapsing across Europe and Asia, some of the very last true threads of that lineage survived not through male descendants, but through women who had children with modern humans, children who would go on to become, in some very literal sense, us. There's still real debate in the field about how much of this was cultural choice versus biological pressure. Researchers like Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London have pushed back on the idea that low genetic diversity alone explains Neanderthal extinction. He points out that plenty of small, inbred populations have survived for a very long time in the wild. The truth is probably layered. Climate shifts, competition with modern humans expanding into their territory, disease, shrinking prey populations. Extinction is rarely one single cause. But the genetic story of Neanderthal women adds a dimension to that ending that almost nobody was talking about until these Siberian caves started giving up their secrets. It also forces a kind of correction on the popular image most of us grew up with. For decades, Neanderthals were drawn in textbooks as brutish, slow, doomed from the start, wiped out because modern humans were simply smarter or faster or more adaptable. But nothing about the genetics of these women reads as primitive or accidental. Patriarchality, the practice of women leaving home to marry outward, is a deliberate social structure. It requires trust networks between distant groups. It requires some shared understanding, maybe even shared language or gesture between communities that might otherwise never interact. A father in one valley essentially had to know, or at least believe, that his daughter would be safe walking toward a group of strangers 100 kilometers away. That is not the behavior of mindless animals stumbling toward extinction. That is the behavior of a society actively managing its own survival, generation after generation, using the one resource it had the most control over, the movement of its young women. And the fact that this system still wasn't enough in the end, that even with women constantly refreshing the gene pool, the overall numbers just kept shrinking. That tells you something sobering about how fragile Neanderthal existence really was. Every single piece of the puzzle, small population size, isolated valleys, an ice age climate that could turn deadly within a single bad winter, was already stacked against them. Before modern humans ever showed up in large numbers, Neanderthal women were fighting a demographic battle that had likely been unwinnable for tens of thousands of years, and they didn't even know they were fighting it. They were just living, migrating, raising children in caves surrounded by strangers who slowly became family, doing what needed to be done because it was simply how the world worked. Now, what strikes me most, honestly, isn't even the science. It's the image underneath it. A girl in an Ice Age valley, standing at the edge of the only home she's ever known, watching her father and brothers stay behind while she walks toward strangers. Because that is simply what was required of her. She had no idea her migration was quietly protecting an entire population from vanishing. She had no idea that, tens of thousands of years later, people like us would dig her ancestors out of the frozen dirt and read her family's entire story written in a molecule she couldn't have imagined existed. She was just trying to survive. And in surviving, in walking that lonely path so many times over so many generations, the women of a vanished human species may have quietly written themselves into every single one of us. If this kind of story, real discoveries, real debates, real people, pulled back out of deep time, is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because there are a lot more of these buried in the ground still waiting to be told. Thanks for watching.